It's a scary thing when he's in control. Okay, we're here for the study of Revelation, and we're going to be looking at chapter 18 tonight. And I was telling Don here, it's now really seeming like the Revelation marathon at this point, and towards like mile 20, where you're really, into the race, but hoping for the finish line. So, and we're closing in on that with chapter 18, and chapter 18 is going to get us through finally in our overall timeline, finally on to the next thing in chapter 19. But this will kind of conclude out the tribulation time, looking at Babylon, and really the chapter is all about the fall of Babylon. And can anybody give a recap? What was last week? Does anybody remember what chapter 17 led us through? The woman and the dragon, the red scarlet woman, red scarlet beast, right? And the last scene of 17 was that the beast, the red dragon, red beast, turned on the woman, right, to devour her. And so this chapter 18 is really it's a conclusive scene of the tribulation period with full judgment of God. And so we'll kind of look at, there's a number of different ways that I saw different commentaries and pastors and things kind of break this chapter down, but I saw this breakdown. MacArthur's commentary broke down this into these different categories of judgment: judgment pronounced and judgment avoided, defined, lamented, enjoyed, and completed. And I thought that really encapsulated well what chapter 18 is really all about for Babylon. So we'll look and work our way through these kind of different descriptions of the final judgments on the fall of Babylon the Great with this chapter. And everybody got notes ready to go? Again, if you want or need, starting last week, Leighton's now recording video with our actual video system, so you might actually even be able to hear it and see it well if you miss a week and want to see some of the video. A lot better than that little camcorder I was using before. So anyway, you can catch up that way if needs be. But we'll kind of dig in here to the judgment that's pronounced. And a lot of times when I'm putting together a little PowerPoint or something, I'll Google image search the chapter just to kind of get a visual picture for myself of things. This one really grabbed my attention, kind of thinking about, again, where we're at the tribulation is all this havoc that's happened all over the earth, the whole globe, the heavens tearing open, the skies falling, the islands being wiped away, and the mountains being flattened. And that's just in the final bowl judgments. The other 14 judgments prior to that have already taken place, getting us to this point. And so this picture in my mind is, okay, yeah, there might not even be this much left of the earth at this point. So it's really just it's interesting to find this picture in my mind and then a full judgment still happening, that humanity hasn't learned to this point, hasn't confessed, repented, turned, any of those things when the world is at this state, or worse maybe even than this. So, I don't know. I'm a little bit pictorial in my mind for learning. They help me along with the words, so maybe they will help you as well. So the judgment is pronounced in verses 1 through 3. Let's look at those. It says there, after this I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for the unclean bird, unclean detestable beast, For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. Quite a pronouncement here. And so you've got a beginning, opening phrase of after this. Well, we covered what the after this was. It was the woman, the scarlet woman, the scarlet beast. So this is really kind of, again, the working out of the final scenes of the tribulation, of God's judgment at the last 3.5 years upon the earth and all those who remain on the earth. So that's what's after. But there's another angel, and it's kind of an interesting way as you work through chapter 18, the descriptions of those who are pronouncing or announcing or speaking. So just kind of maybe take note of that. This is another angel. Well, we've had lots of angels. Which angel could this be? It doesn't really give, it says it's an interesting description, I think, in verse number 1 of this angel. The angel's coming from heaven, okay, so it's from the heavenly scene to the earthly scene. But this angel has great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. So you could look at that description and maybe consider this Christ with some of that kind of description. There's kind of a little bit of a toss-up amongst commentators on the description of this angel. It could be that this angel is one with great authority, like one of the 7 angels who just poured out the bowl judgments. That's the angel that in chapter 17 that we just looked at that was involved was one of those, but it was designated as such in chapter 17. If you remember, the angel in chapter 17 was one of the ones who had poured out the bowl, was the description. Well, this one isn't described that way. The distinctive is this great authority that he lights the earth with his glory. Now, an angelic being coming into a world scene like what we were just looking at, it's going to be pretty dark, right? So probably almost any spiritual being from heaven could light with the glory of heaven that comes with him. I guess I would side with a number of the commentators I was reading that this is not Jesus, it's just an angel with great authority in announcing. Maury?
Well, it says, and the earth was illuminated with his glory, but that H is a small h.
Uh-huh.
So it's not, implying that it's God's glory, if that's correct.
Mm-hmm. And I would interpret the great authority that he has in the same way that the earth is made bright with his glory, that he's got his authority and the glory of God. It's God-given authority, it's God-granted glory, brightness, that kind of thing. Again, more than anything, he's proclaiming something. It's a pronouncing of judgment, verse 2, on Babylon the Great. And so again, we've talked quite a bit even in chapter 17 about who is Babylon the Great. There's ancient Babylon, which was a literal city and people, and that people is also a representative of sinful, wicked humanity, those who openly reject God. But this pronouncement is fallen is Babylon the Great, a dwelling place for demons. Of course, we know that Satan in this time has set up his kingdom and authority within the city of Jerusalem. And so this Babylon is New Babylon, New Rome, New Jerusalem. It's the seat of authority where the demons are, and Satan himself are dwelling. And it's a place for all the unclean spirits, beasts, and birds. It even is, descriptive of the scarlet woman. It goes back into speaking in verse number 3, drinking of the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. That is kind of looking back into 17 about the great harlot, and Babylon is what's written on her head. So again, as I look at that and read and studied about, okay, who is this really describing? What is this describing? I would say it seems to be a combination. A physical place of ruling in the earth, a representative place of Satan's ruling, and a place where all this global battle is centered upon. But more than anything, it's a spirit of open rejection, hatred towards God, is Babylon.
Do you think that there's any geographical connection to the original Babylon, or do you think that Babylon is used because of the personality of that group of people or that group of nations,
Mm-hmm.
irrespective of the geographic location?
Right.
Maybe you just said that. Maybe I didn't hear it, but
I think it's part of the question that we can't know for certain, certainly from this part of the passage. You try to combine all of the descriptions of Babylon from Revelation about what it is, and I think you still come up with not concrete. Many believe that Babylon is describing maybe even a whole new city that will be developed leading into this time.
it's just interesting to me that Babylon was used by God to punish his people.
Yep. That's where it really is representative of humanity for all time, the humanity that rejects God. And so you can't, all these verses are deeply connected with Babylon, the original Babylon, and again, people from the Old Testament all the way through to clearly the end of time who are living in the same manner. We'll see that more in these verses as it's described about, the things that are being destroyed are also things that God destroyed at the Tower of Babel and the Babylonian kingdom and that kind of thing. So you can't really disconnect those. And I think that's intentional here, even at the end of time, that yes, this represents all of wicked, sinful humanity. But it may also represent a physical place, like an actual city, place on earth. Is that in existence, or is it going to be in a place that's in existence now? Lots of conjecture about that being possible. I've heard a lot of conjecture about Baghdad being a place that represents future Babylon, geographically, kind of thing, which is interesting, but especially with the history of Iraq and things like that. I wouldn't say that I could give a definitive answer to, is this a geographical place, or I think it's a both and, a representation. And I do think there's probably a geographical place that it represents because it talks about the physical damage to the city itself and the earth around it and the human beings that are there. So I really see it is a combination of all of those things. That's a lot of words for an answer, but
I'm afraid it's the United States is what I'm afraid of, because in Saudi Arabia they kill you if you have sex man on man. Here it's okay.
yeah.
There's something wrong with our country.
Yeah. It's interesting, again, as you look at the time of God's judgment and destruction associated with that judgment, back to pre-Noah flood, when the earth needed to be destroyed because of sinful, wicked humanity. They were in such a wicked state, and often sexual immorality is tied with that judgment and destruction. Sodom and Gomorrah, what was some of the great description of their wickedness, sexual immorality. Again, here in Revelation, it's for the same. And for a Muslim-led nation, that's looked upon very, poorly. I mean, in that sense, they've got that right. Lots of other things not, but they do not support, affirm any sort of homosexual lifestyle. So I would still say that this seems to be centered somewhere within geographical closeness to Jerusalem. So in my mind, it's not the United States, but the United States represents what Babylon represents, and much the case even today. But that's a whole other study. The United States in end times prophecy. What's there? Another study. Okay, so then the interesting thing in verse 3, there's a judgment here that's pronounced on sort of three different groupings, and these three different groupings are mentioned throughout all of chapter 18. You've got, for all the nations drunk, this is the judgment that's pronounced. The nations are going to be judged, the kings of the earth, they committed immorality, and the merchants of the earth. So nations, kings, and merchants. There's kind of three groupings here to sort of take note. And again, those are described again in verses 9 through 19. I think the reason that I see that woven throughout this chapter is it really represents what Babylon is. It's mankind thinking that he's got some kind of authority as a king, thinking that he's got control of things as a merchant. Nations, in the sense of a unified group of nations, whether that's politically, religiously, whatever, can actually come against God, is foolish, but that's why they're being judged. So nations, kings, and merchants there are the ones being judged, and really what represents Babylon. Still tracking? Here we go. Okay, so you've got the judgment that's pronounced amongst Babylon, but then you've got, again, this is how Revelation is, and it, to me, is a beautiful thing, how God weaves in through his words. Again, Revelation is not just to show judgment, it's to give hope and for believers. So I think that's what verse 4 and 5 is. It's a hope, it's a calling. Come out of her, my people, is this calling that you hear in verses 4 and 5. I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues, for her sins are heaped as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. All right, this is a different voice. Certainly the way in which it's worded, and I heard another voice. This time it doesn't say that it's an angel. It's not another angel, it's another voice. Okay, so anybody got a red letter version? Is this in red? Yeah, interesting. I would say there's more support for this potentially being God or Christ, God the Father or God the Son, than the first one in being another angel. This one is just another voice. Come out of her, my people. That my people is a pretty interesting phrase that an angel doesn't make sense that an angel would use that kind of phraseology necessarily. So this seems to be a calling of God. It could be an angel calling for God, just like an angel was in verses 1 through 3 talking. So, but come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, share in her plagues. Again, this is referring to Babylon, who's going to be judged, but there's a judgment that can be avoided by those who will come out, that's the church, are the called out ones. That's literally what our name means. The Christian name, the church of God, are called out ones. The ecclesia are the called out. And what are we called out of? We're called out of sin. We're called to be not living in a lifestyle of sin or like the world or led by the devil. All three of those things, we're called to come out of that. So that's where this is directed towards the church. And then again, verse 5, still that the her is referring to Babylon. So But verse 5 is kind of interesting. I think verse 5 is a direct tie to the Tower of Babel. Her sins are heaped as high as heaven. Heaped as high as heaven. Those who were, in Babylon, Nimrod was leading the charge to build what? A tower to heaven. They've heaped, and the word heaped there is actually, in the Greek, is one that means glued, like gluing things together. Their sins are glued. They've tried to construct something as high as the heaven, but all they've done is heaped their sins one on top of another. Just a really interesting word picture as you kind of dig into the meaning behind the words. Babylon's sins are glued, heaped up as high as heaven, but none of them, obviously, sins aren't going to get you to heaven either. And God has remembered her iniquities. Well, of course, he would have remembered her sin and rejection during the tribulation, but again, I think this is remembering all the way back to that original thinking that they could build a tower to heaven. Verse 5, I think, is a real tie to the Old Testament. I think it can apply to this time in the end of times as well. So there's a judgment that can be avoided. You don't have to endure the judgment of God if you know him, if you're out of the world and the flesh and the devil. Called out ones are the church. Thoughts, questions? I love those little, here you go, church, here you go, picture. Maury?
I've just been trying to keep track of where the Christians,
Yeah.
day one, when I come across it, it says, come out of her, my people. And so I'm saying to myself, that means there's Christians still on the planet, okay?
Okay.
When they became Christians, well, we know they're there. That's about all I can say about that. But if you go back and look at the various places where words like they, or the saints, or other references to Christians, they keep popping up.
Yeah.
And here we are, chapter 18, and we're still seeing these references to my people.
Yep.
And there's something there, I don't know exactly what it is, but I find it.
Yeah, it's okay. Is John hearing, seeing, writing this about the Christians who may still be on the earth at this point in the tribulation? Or obviously, sovereign, all-knowing God knows that we would have the Bible right now, today. This could be a call for us. It's that from the very first opening lesson introduction is, who is this written to? Actually, the 7 churches. Right? So this is written to them first. So those 7 churches referenced by John are literal physical towns, cities, people, churches. So it's to them that they're to come out. It's to me today to be called out, come out, anytime in between, and potentially to the end. Yeah. That's that. How does this apply? It does. It seems to, God's got that covered by continually bringing it up. Yep.
Well, and if it's the Christians that are in that time in the future, where do they go? Where do they come out of? Where do they go if they come out of something? I mean, the world is in such bad shape.
Yep.
Are they raptured? They'd have to be raptured to get out of there.
Yep. The language is interesting. If it's written to them at that time, come out. Well, the only way you're coming out is death, likely. In that sense, if that's who it's written to, my mind goes to stand firm. Like, stand for me, even though it certainly means death. That's how you come out from them and their sins at the time. You just stand up for what's right. Yeah. That's what my mind kind of goes to. If it's for...
I like what you just said about it was for the people in 7 churches at the time. Because they're reading this, and so they're
Yeah.
seeing all this stuff that's happening to it. And said,
Yeah,
another reason to come out.
You look at some of those towns, my mind always goes to Corinth, because Corinth is like the ancient picture of modern Vegas, just wicked, sin city kind of place. And even, Kathy, what you were talking about, what America looks like in our sexual immorality, just being abundant. Think about some of those towns that were the seven churches or some of the others that Gospels were written to, Paul's writings to, there was just really awful things happening then, as far as open, wicked sin sort of thing. So,
You know, when I see the word come out of her, aren't Christians supposed to be set apart anyway?
yep,
He's basically just telling us, behave,
yeah,
you know?
yep, that looked different. Yeah, all of those references that the calling out is calling out in living, in how you live. Don't live like them. Don't take part in what she does. They do. Okay? Then you have a judgment defined in verses 6 through 8. This is kind of interesting. This is how God's judgment is being doled out, if you will. Pay her back. Notice you still got some italics here, so this is still being spoken. And so the spoken seems to still be referencing another voice from verse 4. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for the deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she's mixed. If you want to just take all that to modern language, she's getting what she's earned. She's getting what it's coming to her, what she deserves. And she glorified herself, lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning, since in her heart she says, I sit as queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for mighty is the Lord God who has judged her. So this judgment, really verse 8, is the summary of that. It's the Lord God who is judging sin here. But the judgment is due. It's right. It's righteous judgment because of her deeds. And her deeds have been wicked, not just towards God, but towards others as well, everyone around her. And verse 7 really, she glorifies herself. This is the overwhelming human sin of pride, right? Pride is in each one of us, and it's something that, I have to fight daily in myself, right? Is this pride of my own life. This is pride really to the extreme, but what's being described in verse 7, she glorified herself. So there's pride in herself through living in luxury, so wealth. She depended in her own wealth. And so she's going to get torment and mourning of like measure to the luxury in which she lived is the torment in which she will live as well. And then in her heart she says, I sit as queen, I'm no widow, I shall never see mourning. But yes, you will. You will see judgment, and it will be right. Because of that kind of attitude, and I don't know if any of you ever have kids, but if you've ever talked with them about their actions, you've probably also talked to them about their attitude related to those actions, right? Right, son, back there? Not that we ever talk about those things, but if we do, sometimes, more than anything, it's our attitude that needs adjusting. And that is certainly here. And because of her attitude, the plagues that will come upon her and destroy her will come in this reference of a single day. The single day doesn't mean that all of the judgment of God happens. Oh, did you hear me? Yeah. Doesn't mean it just happens in a day. In a single day, you'll see later here it's phrased within an hour. It's basically a short period of time. Judgment is coming fast, it's coming full, and it's coming because of sin, and the Lord God will do it. It's coming from Him. That's kind of the judgment defined from God. Thoughts, questions there? So far, pretty straightforward. Maury? Gary?
The single day reference reminds me of the book of Job, where the messenger
Yeah.
He lost his family, he lost his farms, he lost his animals, he lost everything in one day.
Yeah.
And while that messenger was still speaking, the next messenger shows up and
With more bad news.
more bad news.
And yet, Job remains faithful. It's the opposite picture of the world having opportunity to repent, to choose the Lord and remain faithful to Him. I love the Old Testament pictures, not just of judgment, but of faithfulness. Pictures of Christ, the many pictures of Christ. So. Okay. Maury? Okay. This next. Uh-oh. Did it die? Go. Okay. This next kind of section is a little bit bigger section. Verses 9 through 19 is a judgment that's lamented. This is really the response of humanity to all of this quick, severe judgment that has happened, is happening, the proclamation of the finality of that judgment. This is how they respond. Here's verses 9 through 14. And the kings of the earth who committed the sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her, they will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory. Some very descriptive things here. All kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, chariots, slaves, that is, human souls. There's a whole description. There's a whole list of things. This is what they're weeping over. All those things. Verse 14, the fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and all your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. If that wasn't enough, here's a little bit more. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand afar off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city was clothed in fine linen, purple, scarlet, adorned with gold, jewels, and with pearls. Notice their focus. Things. Stuff. Rather than the world crumbling around them, their own sin is right in their face. They're worried about jewels and pearls and wood and all those things. Verse 17, for in a single hour all this wealth has been laid to waste. It's about money. And all shipmasters, seafaring men, sailors, all those who trade is on the sea, stood off and cried out loud as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads. They wept and mourned, crying aloud, Alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships, the sea grew rich for her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid to waste. What a bunch of crybabies. Huh? I mean, they just on and on they go. This is basically the whole world weeping. And again, there's a couple categories of weepers, if you will. Verses 9 and 10 there in part one, the kings of the earth are the first ones to cry out loud. And then verses 11 through 19 cover the merchants. And they're really crying. They're listing out every single thing, and this is what they're crying over. And it continues in verse 15 into the more weeping and mourning aloud. And then even the merchants, in particular the seafaring merchants, which is interesting. Again, you think about all the things that have happened on earth to this point. And so the city that's being described of wailing for, this city that had all this seems to point, this part of the judgment is that, this is a physical city. Because they're seeing the smoke that's burning from it and that the city is collapsed. This, I think, really is pointing to, I didn't write it down. I was like, I'll remember. the part where we already covered, where the city is broken into three parts. The great earthquake happens, and it's broken into three parts. I think that's tied to this same passage in that what they see is that great city, physical city, as well as what it represents, is cracked and broke open, smoke and burning, like that first picture that gave me kind of a picture. All the buildings are falling apart and falling down. Even the people out in the boats in the water are looking at it like that's where it all was, and it's gone. So there's a whole bunch of crying. There's a whole bunch of reference to the destruction of a single hour. Now it's gone from a day's destruction to a single hour's destruction. Well, how could that be? Well, the description again of the great earthquake is that in the moments, how long does an earthquake last? Actually, they can be pretty quick, though you often get aftershocks. And sometimes the aftershocks are just nearly as bad as the original quake. And so that large earthquake and all the hailstones, remember the hailstones that were the size of a Volkswagen were falling. So all of that's happened. That kind of destruction in a single hour of that would certainly destroy much. There's obviously people left to cry about all those things, but again, their focus is on the things and on the city, not on the Lord, not on eternal perspective at all, completely on worldly perspective. They're worried about the money that's tied to the city and the money that's tied to the things that they were able to trade. So obviously this city is a global power of trade that happens in and out. Everything happens via this city. Right now, in the world we live in, there's not one city that really controls it like this description. I think things have got to fall apart more to centralize all of that power into something like this, where the whole world depends on a single city, and when it's destroyed, it's over.
I would tweak that a little bit, Joel, just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Let me say it this way. First John says that you're either in the light or you're in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
You're either under the influence of evil or you're under the influence of the Holy Spirit. It's really that simple in a sense for all mankind. And I look at this and I look at this and I think this is the evil, monetary, gluttonous, lusting, sinful darkness that's manifested itself in this dynamic monetary system globally.
Yep.
And the people that are in those places are so gone, they're so deep into the darkness that their wealth has consumed them.
Yep.
And their consumption and their fornication, all of that has consumed them. So I think Babylon is a location, but when we talk about this monetary system being completely and utterly destroyed, especially when it says that they're dealing in the bodies and the souls of men. It's one thing to be dealing with precious objects, but not only that, they took it one step deeper, and they're messing with, and you can go wherever you want to go with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in a sense that it happens in that physical location, but the repercussions is a complete global meltdown of all economies and all commerce,
Yeah.
in a sense.
In the notes that I handed out, they're under this section 9 through 19, the judgment lamented. The merchants of the earth describe a couple major categories that they're lamenting over, and then under each category they list these things. So under money, they specifically mention gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls. Then in clothing, they talk about fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet. Okay, so money, clothes. They even talk about furniture of citron wood and ivory, building materials of wood, bronze, iron, and marble. They're covering all these major categories. Fragrance, cinnamon, incense, fragrant oils, frankincense. The major staples of basically surviving, living of wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, the things you can't live without. Livestock, they talk about cattle and sheep. Transport, they talk about chariots and horses. And then they finish with this category of mankind, bodies and souls of men. That's one that caught me a little bit too, was okay, yeah, I understand all the economic stuff tied to all the other stuff, and livelihood, right? But then it talks about this, bodies and souls of men. I think you can garner two thoughts about that. I think it's talking about the physical man and the spiritual man, right? Because the soul of man is the spiritual nature, but I think it's talking about the physical body in this way. Human trafficking. I think this is referencing human trafficking. This is something that's a major problem. There's a pandemic, if you will, of human trafficking today that's happening. The realities of that in the world we live, which are only going to get worse, that were also really bad in the time in which John was writing, right? Global slave trade that was happening was, a horrific thing. But the money that's in human trafficking, there's as much money, they say, in human trafficking as there is drug trafficking. And so I think this is a combination of, there's a spiritual destruction of man here, but the lamenting about the bodies of man is even that the money associated with human trafficking is destroyed. Alan?
Do you think Babylon is more than one city or more than one country? Because it deals with so many different aspects.
Yep.
So it seems like it's more than one.
Yeah, Babylon, I think Babylon does represent a global hub of a physical city, but it really just represents all humanity with all of these problems, which ultimately are of the heart. They have deceived themselves, been deceived. They've darkened their hearts. They've turned it away from God. It's a heart issue. It's for humanity, it's always a heart issue. Choose God, light or dark, as you're saying, Maury, is that. And these have, in their wicked, sinful, darkened hearts, chosen to reject God and choose this. And so they're crying about it because they feel like this is everything. There is nothing left. At this, there's literally nothing left for any of humanity who's chosen to reject God.
And they're not even capable of knowing what's going on to them.
Yeah.
I mean, they have no idea. In certain ways, sure, the news has talked about it, but the whole idea of God judging the world, they're like, yeah, right.
Yeah, sure. Right.
It's like, no, we just lost our brilliance.
Right.
That's a big deal.
Yep. Okay, so this is the world's response to the judgment is to cry about their stuff and not turn to God. Here's an interesting, quick little blip. Verse 20 is the judgment enjoyed. Enjoyed? I don't know if that's the right word, but rejoice is the word. There is rejoicing, verse 20, over her. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. So this is a call for rejoicing. This is a call. Now, ultimately, it's rejoicing. It's praise to God for his righteous judgment. But really, this is about God avenging his people for their persecution, for their death, for all the things that those who have given their lives and their hearts to God, they are to rejoice over her, Babylon, and who? The ones who are in heaven, saints, apostles, prophets. God has given judgment for you against her. Kind of a...
And he fulfills his promise to the folks under the altar, right?
Yes, yep. This verse 20 is an absolute fulfillment of prophecy for God's people.
How long should we wait?
Right. How long do we have to wait for?
And here it is.
There it is. Yep. And this is really for all time of that, waiting for full recompense of those who have been against God's people. Again, it's another little insert thing. And then, sorry, I didn't pull it up. PowerPoint gives me a preview, and so I'm looking at the preview slide and not looking behind me. There's the verse 20. And then it moves into the final part, verses 21 to 24, which is the judgment that's completed. There's the best picture I could find on Google image search of an angel carrying a millstone. So that's what verse 21 through 24 talks about, this completed judgment. It's the finality of Babylon's fall. It says there, verse 21, then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon the great city be thrown down with violence and will be found no more. Sound of harpists and musicians, flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more, and the craftsmen of any craft be found in you no more, and the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. The light and lamp will shine in you no more. The voice of the bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. Your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. There's a repetition. This is kind of a poetic type song, if you will, that it's a message that another angel, mighty angel, some would say the mighty refers to the archangels. This is an archangel who picks up this stone to enact God's judgment. One of the order of Michael's angels. Doesn't say that, just says a mighty angel. So the mighty angel picks up a great stone and throws it into the sea. Like the water sea? Or what is the sea? Yes. I think, is there a literal stone into the sea? Well, we've seen that in the judgment on the earth already. That kind of seems more like a burning asteroid from the sky. This has a different picture, a little bit. What's a millstone used for? Grinding, crushing, rolling over. They would use a big millstone in the olive press when they were trying to press the oil out of the olives and crush them all down. It's a big stone with a hole in the middle and a big stick through it, and turn it around this other big basin and crush all of those olives and seeds until the oil comes out, which is kind of a neat picture. But in this way, the millstone is being used to crush, not water. Humanity, I think, is a better representation of what this sea is talking about. The millstone is God's judgment on people. So the mighty angel does this act of judgment against people, and the people is clearly listed as Babylon, the great city. And I think 21 is really a good summation of the finality of this judgment. The rest of it is sort of extra description that's poetic, but basically Babylon will be found no more. You could just summarize the whole thing in that. Of course, there's not going to be flutists or harpists or craftsmen or brides or grooms, lights or anything else. Everything, this is the finality of God's judgment and destruction of wicked, sinful humanity here. And so you've got this completed judgment, and the final verses, verse 23 and 24, kind of give, it's interesting, not that there's need for any more reasons why. We kind of know why, but there's kind of three more reasons for this judgment, this kind of complete judgment given. It says in verse 23, kind of towards the end, that's the joining thing here. There's not going to be any light because your merchants were the great ones of the earth. That's reason one. What about these great men? Why is that a reason to be judged, do you think? Yep, certainly of God not being first in their lives or their priorities or their who are great ones? The merchants. This is, again, tied to wealth, I think. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth.
It's the people that raped the earth of all its resources
Yeah,
and built giant, huge industries, and they just ran up Satan's ladder of success
right.
and never looked back.
Money and power.
Money and power.
That's why God's judgment is just, because they pursued money and power rather than him. So that I think is the tie to this great men, or these merchants, the great ones of the earth. So that's a reason given. The next one is, and, at the end of verse 23, all nations were deceived by your sorcery. That word sorcery in the Greek is an interesting one. Anybody got their Greek New Testament with them? Pharmakeia. Does it sound like anything? Drugs, medicines, reliance upon our own.
On our COVID-19
I wasn't going there, Don. Some might.
These pharmaceutical companies are some of the richest in the world, right?
If you think about that, this is directly tied to the merchants' money and power. So is this. Sorcery is used, pharmaceuticals are used for what? Money and power. So this is the same root, different methodology. So economics through merchants, also by those who were in the pharmaceutical world. We can kind of believe this to be true now, maybe more than ever, right? So the nations get deceived by sorcery, by pharmaceuticals. Take note of that, right? That seems very applicable. Don't need to take it any further than that, but that's what it says. Then verse 24, here's the third thing. And in her, Babylon, was found the blood of the prophets, saints, and all who have been slain on earth. Murder. I mean, the reason is because of their murderous, wicked hearts. They've literally sought out and killed God's people. And that was just out of pure hatred. That wasn't done for money, per se, or power. Maybe, being in control, but more than anything, it was just out of hatred. That the final listed thing of the reasons for Babylon's destruction. So, that's the end of Babylon as we know it, because the scene really changes. Moving into chapter 19, you've got Babylon and all its wicked and gross and destruction, and it shall be no more, and then heavenly hallelujahs. In chapter 19, there's a real turn of the page here. So it's kind of we've waded through a lot of the hard, wicked, dark things, but he is coming. He's coming victoriously, powerfully on his white horse, and it says those who believe in him will come with him at that point of victory, at the end of judgment. So just imagine yourself as one of these. I was telling a horse riding story earlier, Mark. It wasn't quite like this picture, though. This will be a lot better. I had a bad experience riding a horse, and I don't ever want to ride a horse again until this day. So, but be a cowboy, they said, in Cody, Wyoming, until you get on that bouncy horse up a mountain. So, there we go. Chapter 18, the fall of Babylon the Great. Thoughts, questions, concerns? Yes.
Back when Jesus, he commanded demons to come out of people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think these people could have been Christians who had demons in them? Still, that didn't get raptured? Or could they have been demons in them and called them out lest they...
If they're Christians at this point in the tribulation, I would say no longer are demons looking to influence, sidetrack, Christians, they're trying to kill them. So I don't think, yeah, and this is a different discussion. Different discussions always come up when you're in Revelation, but about demon possession, I'm a pretty firm believer that I think Christians can be influenced, attacked. I do not think they can be possessed. So,
Greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world.
right, yep, yep, because I have a different spirit in me that is greater than anything that would try to possess me. So in that sense, different. Yeah, good question though. Okay, chapter 18, we did it. There's some pictures still. I'm not giving up on my drawing challenge. The graphic study has got to be pictorial.